Hi, in this chapter we're going to talk about the Russian domain. Here's some neat false color imagery. I believe this is St. Petersburg. False color means we're looking at wavelengths that our eyes necessarily can't see. Our eyes can only see a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, the red, the green, the blue. There's lots of other wavelengths that the sun gives off or the earth emits, such as thermal or microwaves or alpha, gamma, near infrared, long infrared. So I thought this was pretty neat to show. This is what we're looking at when we look at the Russian domain. It's mainly going to be dominated by the country of Russia, but we do extend from Ukraine down to the south to Azerbaijan, and then all the way to the west, almost to Alaska here. And I've got a neat map here on my Google Maps. I like referring to Google Maps. You can see how large Russia is. And you can see how far north it goes. So you can see over, in the west, all the way to the east. And if actually you zoom in enough, we've got a couple islands. These are called the Diomede Islands. One belongs to the United States at Alaska, and this is just to the west of 180 degrees west longitude. So technically this is east. But I thought this was neat. We've got Big Diomede, which belongs to Russia, Little Diomede, which belongs to the United States. Big Diomede isn't populated, but if we zoom in enough, look what we have right here. This is an Alaskan town called Diomede. I thought this was kind of interesting, playing with the maps. And if we zoom out, we can look at the scale at the bottom right, so we can see how far it is from mainland Alaska. So let me get back to this here. So it's a large domain. If I haven't mentioned it yet, it's the largest country in the world by far. I think it's about 8 million square miles. It's got cold winters, cool summers. And then these are just some of the environmental issues that we have here. We do have a plate boundary that runs through the Kamchatka Peninsula over here. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's mainly, tectonic free. And then we've got this boundary here called the Ural Mountains, which serve as the boundary between the landmass of Europe and Asia. But we'll talk about this. You can see the Russian plain to the west of the Ural Mountains. So it serves as a really good physical political boundary, or physical boundary in this case. And we can look at the distribution of population. So we've got St. Petersburg, we've got Russia, we don't have much to the east of the Ural Mountains. This talks about some of the environmental geography, some of the challenges just in terms of dealing with distance. So we have something called permafrost, cold climate, unstable, seasonally frozen ground that limits the growth of vegetation, and also the construction of roads and even tracks or whatnot. So these are the Ural Mountains, not necessarily the tallest, but serve as a long boundary, north-south boundary, to separate Europe from Asia. You can see some of the climate regimes. We've got some Bs, and then mainly your Ds, and once you get into your Es with your polar climates and your tundra. We have some real stark temperature decreases here, especially when we look at this whole idea of continentality. When we get into intercontinents, we have large temperature ranges that can get very high and very, very low. And we can see, the impact of Russia's, the location compared to the rest of the United States. So southern Russia is pretty much on the same latitude as central United States. And then we can see the agricultural divisions here of Russia. On the left, we've got taiga, boreal forest landscape. On the right, we have tundra. We have wheat farming throughout much of western Russia. The breadbasket is sometimes the term they use. And the other issue they deal with is just the movement of resources. One of the long-lasting effects that Russia's dealt with is air and water pollution, poor air quality for a number of cities, and then poor water quality, the shrinking of the Aral Sea in this particular region, and more so in Central Asia. So we can see areas affected by acid rain, and more so some of these polluted features here down near the Caspian Sea, which technically they call it a sea, but it's technically the largest lake in the world. You can see how big it is according to this scale. Black Sea is actually a sea. It's connected out to the Mediterranean by the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, which are straits that connect that out, eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. But this Caspian Sea is fed by rivers, and some of these are polluted in the case. You can see oil fields, Azerbaijan. And then you can see some of the environmental degradation that this particular region is dealing with. And we'll talk more about this when we get into these stand countries here in Central Asia, especially with the Ural Sea. Idea of nuclear threat, above ground testing, Chernobyl. When I was in junior high school, we heard about this. Okay, not much was known about it because back then Russia was very isolated. It was kind of this us versus them mentality. We had movies such as Rocky IV, Rambo, where Russia was looked at as the quote unquote bad guys. Okay? With glasnost and perestroika in the late 80s and early 90s, Russia has really opened up culturally and has served as a tourist destination. So how does the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union's demise bring about environmental recovery with Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and some of these other countries in the region? How do we handle waste materials? What's going to happen with Chernobyl and that region in the Ukraine in 50 or 100 years from now? It's been more than 30 years. So you can see the population distribution, and we can see this population, our dot density map here, most of the people live in or close to Europe here, mainland Europe, even though the Eastern Europe is part of Europe, or Western Russia is part of Europe, but when we break this down regionally. But you can see our dot density map. Okay? Out in the west, a lot. Out in the east, much less. So we've got Siberia. So this region out here we call Siberia. Sparsely populated. They had the Trans-Siberian Railroad that was completed in 1904. We've got other railroads. This talks about some of the migration settlement patterns. The Gulag Archipelago, vast collection of political prisons. And then some of the outmigration from Russia. And like most countries, we've got this rural to urban migration. So you can see, where, especially within this region, where people are going to Western Russia. One of the issues they've been dealing with is the declining populations in particular regions. Right? Even though, they did get rid of communism, it's brought about another set of issues. And Russia is one of the countries that have declining population rates of natural increase. So, people are having less kids, economic conditions aren't quite as good. Okay? So these days, population is about the same. Every day in Russia, about the same number of people are born as they die. And we talked about that a little bit with places like Italy and Denmark and maybe Sweden. Okay? And those are counterbalanced by in-migration. Okay? Immigration or emigration from other countries. So you can see some of the housing that's going to be remnant of former Soviet Russia. And then you can see St. Petersburg. This is just another cityscape that we have here. Origins of the Russian state from the Slavic peoples in the west, and then Mongols in the east. And you can see how the Russian state, it expanded. And you can see the territorial acquisition of it throughout the years. And then you can see the former, Soviet curtain. And there were former Soviet republics such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which were all communist countries until the 1980s, early 1990s. And so with the breakdown of Soviet Union and basically eliminating communism, a lot of these countries have fended on their own. Some of them done quite well, especially East Germany is just integrated into Germany, but others not so much. We've got Mongolia down here, which is kind of tucked between China, Soviet Union. So this talks about the geography of language. And you can see some of the languages related to Russia and the Russian domain. Transcaucasan, okay, the Caucasus region down in south. And then the Russian Orthodox churches. You can see some examples of these. Talk about some of these breakaway republics. We talked about previously Yugoslavia, or the breakup of Yugoslavia into smaller countries: Slovenia, Macedonia, Bosnia, Kosovo, which is one of the newest ones. But in this Caucasus region here, which is between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, we can see some of these breakaway republics. We do have Armenia, and we have Azerbaijan. It's interesting because we have these enclaves and exclaves. Here are pieces of Azerbaijan that are separated from each other. We have Armenia. And then we have other places that aren't countries: Chechnya, Ossetia, Dagestan. Are these going to become countries at some point in time? Are their own countries at some point in time? Russia says no. But we do have Georgia here. It's an actual country. And we've got these few countries here, but one of these breakaway republics is going to have their own, or have their own autonomy. And you can just see this at a different scale. So it talks about the fall of the Soviet Union, deluge of Western culture, predominance of Russia, as well as, there are some conservative elements and nationalistic. Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, last of the Tsars, and there were the Bolsheviks, faction of Russian communists representing the interest of industrial workers, which kind of went through early 1990s. It was based on 15 Union republics, some of which we'll talk about in this chapter, others in Central Asia with your stand countries: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. And these are these autonomous areas, ethnic homelands. We'll look at a map here of this particular area here. But we'll talk about these with Central Asia as well as Afghanistan, which are landlocked. We've got the port of Kaliningrad, which is an exclave. So a little chunk right here, that is Russia. That's separated. Okay, so when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania separated from Russia, at least it had access to the Baltic Sea here. So this is another example of a exclave, like we saw here with Azerbaijan and smaller extent Armenia. So you can see this exclave right here with these three kind of breakaway republics. Those were in 1989. End of the Soviet system with glasnost and perestroika. And then geopolitically, there was the Commonwealth of Independent States, and those were representing the former Soviet republics in the Olympics before formalization of these countries later. And then you can just see some of these internal republics you can see in this Caucasus region, Dagestan. There are some other ones in other places here. Tulva is another one near Mongolia. And this just kind of still talks about some of the geopolitics, relationships with other countries. It extends very far, so it's got its hands in a lot of different relationships and geopolitics and the need for transportation, access to airspace, access to waterways. You can see all of the natural resources we have here. The forest, manufacturing, railroad, iron. Alcoholism, smoking, HIV/AIDS. And you can see where the movement of dollars go in. And that's about it for Russia and the Russian domain.